The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the dusty auction yard in San Angelo, Texas. The air hung thick with heat and the smell of old wood sweat and dry hay. In the center pen stood a horse that looked more like a ghost than a living creature, ribs showing beneath a dull coat, eyes that seemed too tired to hope. Around the pen, weathered men in dusty jeans leaned on the fencing, their cowboy hats pulled low over sun-creased brows, watching in silence. This wasn't a place for second chances. Most animals here were sold by the pound, their fate sealed the moment bidding started. The auctioneer, a red-faced man with a booming voice, slapped the railing with his palm. "Next up," he barked, gesturing toward the skeletal horse. A few murmurs rolled through the crowd. One man chuckled. "Ain't much left of that one but bones." Another added, "Meat truck's gonna have a field day." No one bothered to ask the horse's name. In places like this, names didn't matter, only weight. But the horse didn't lower his head in defeat. He stood still, hooves planted firmly, eyes fixed on something far beyond the fences, as though remembering a world that once welcomed him. The auctioneer cleared his throat. "Starting bid it? Hold on just a minute," came a shaky voice from behind the crowd. "Let me see his left flank." The crowd parted. Curiosity stirred. An older man made his way forward, leaning on a hand-carved walking stick. Frank Morgan wore a faded flannel shirt and worn jeans that had seen better days. Deep lines etched his weathered face, testament to years under the Texas sun. His hands, rough from decades of labor, trembled slightly as he approached the pen. The auctioneer frowned. "We ain't got all day, Frank." Frank ignored him, eyes locked on the horse. He stepped into the pen slowly, cautiously. The animal didn't flinch as Frank reached toward his flank, gently brushing away matted hair. Frank froze, his breath catching. "Dear God," he whispered. Faint, almost erased by time and neglect, was a brand, an M crossed with a 5-point star. This is Phantom," Frank's voice cracked with emotion. "My granddaughter's horse. He disappeared the night she did." A hush fell over the crowd. The auctioneer stared at the brand, then at Frank. "You mean Rebecca Morgan, the girl who went missing 10 years ago?" Frank nodded, unable to speak for a moment. When he finally found his voice, it came as a whisper that somehow carried to every ear in the silent yard. If Phantom made it back, maybe she did too. No one moved. The sun dipped lower shadows stretching across the pen. What had started as just another livestock auction had become the opening chapter of a mystery long buried, one that would shake the town of San Angelo to its core. Frank stood in the center of the pen, one hand still resting gently on Phantom's side. His legs felt weak, but his heart pounded with the strength of a man 40 years younger. The quiet murmurs around him had turned into focused stares. Everyone in San Angelo remembered the Morgan case. The night Rebecca disappeared had sent shockwaves through their quiet ranching community. Now, a decade later, her horse had resurfaced without warning, dirty and broken, but unmistakably Phantom. Sheriff Jack Wilson arrived within 20 minutes, dust trailing behind his patrol truck. He stepped out slowly, boots crunching over the dry earth, his expression unreadable beneath the brim of his hat. "Frank," he said with a slow nod, "I never thought I'd see you back here." Frank didn't return the greeting. His eyes never left Phantom. "He came back, Jack," he muttered, "which means she might not be dead. Or," Wilson rubbed his chin, "it means someone's been hiding something for 10 damn years." The sheriff examined the brand carefully, taking photos with his phone. Unlike Frank, whose hand still trembled with emotion, Wilson moved with the calculated precision of a man who'd spent 20 years in law enforcement. He was in his early 50s with salt and pepper hair and eyes that missed nothing. "We'll need to document everything," Wilson said, "and I want a vet to check him out, see if there's anything that might tell us where he's been." As Phantom was led gently to a trailer, Frank followed closely, eyes scanning every inch of the horse's body. There were new scars, thin lines along his legs, a small cut behind his ear that had healed wrong. These weren't from fences or wild terrain. They looked deliberate, controlled. That realization hit Frank harder than he expected. Someone had kept this horse trained. It used it. Someone knew someone had known all along. Back at the sheriff's office, old case files were pulled from the archives. Dust-covered boxes with yellowing papers and faded photographs. Rebecca's school ID, a report of a broken gate on the Morgan Ranch witness statements, full of guesses and dead ends. The case had gone cold by the third month. Too few leads, too much pain. Frank had always blamed himself for letting her ride alone that evening. He had told her to stay close, but she'd gone off toward the creek. She was 15. Then, headstrong and confident on horseback. Now she would be 25 if she was still alive. Sheriff Wilson flipped through an old report, his brow furrowed. There was one name that came up back then, he said. Nathan Reed. He left town the week after Rebecca disappeared. No forwarding address. Frank's jaw tightened. Nathan had worked on the ranch for 5 years. He'd been quiet, kept to himself, but he always had a way with horses. Rebecca had trusted him. Maybe too much. I remember him, Frank said, his voice low. Good with the animals. I never thought. He didn't have a record, Wilson continued. But he packed up and vanished the day after the last official search. That was no coincidence. If Nathan Reed was involved, then the return of Phantom wasn't just a miracle. It was a message, and Frank intended to decode it, whatever the cost. That night, Frank sat alone at his kitchen table, the same table where Rebecca used to do her homework, where she'd laugh and tell him about her day. The radio hummed softly in the background, playing some old country tune that barely filled the silence. Phantom was in the barn, fed and calm, the same barn Rebecca used to sneak out from when she thought he wasn't looking. Frank reached into a drawer and pulled out a photo. Rebecca in her riding boots, smiling wide, Phantom at her side. Her dark hair was pulled into a braid, her eyes lit with the kind of fire only teenagers carried. He hadn't seen that kind of light in 10 years. Sleep didn't come easily. Every creak in the house sounded louder than usual. Every gust of wind against the windows reminded him of that night. The storm, the panic, the endless search. Frank had always believed Rebecca had either run off or been taken. But now, with Phantom back, he couldn't shake the feeling that the truth had been closer than anyone imagined, and that someone had made sure it stayed hidden. By morning, Frank was sitting across from Margaret Fletcher in her antique shop on Main Street. Once a journalist with ambitions for bigger publications, Margaret had returned to San Angelo after her divorce, turning her passion for history into a business. At 62, her hair had gone silver, but her mind remained sharp as ever. Nathan Reed, Margaret repeated, tapping a pencil against her lips. I remember him. Came into my shop once, bought an old map of the river trails. Said he liked to ride alone. She leaned forward. That was just a week before Rebecca disappeared. I need to find him, Frank said, his voice steady with determination. If he's still out there, he has answers. Margaret nodded slowly. Let me help. If he left a trail, we'll find it. Over the next 2 days, Margaret transformed her back office into an investigation headquarters. Newspaper clippings, old town directories, and property records covered every surface. Frank had given her everything he remembered about Nathan Reed, where he slept on the ranch, the kind of truck he drove, even how he used to whistle while working the stables. Most of it seems like nothing, Margaret admitted, pushing her reading glasses up her nose. But men like that never truly vanish. They just change their name and find quieter places to hide. Meanwhile, Frank spent hours in the barn with Phantom. The horse was gaining weight, already responding to regular feedings and clean water. But he still flinched at certain movements, especially when Frank got near his neck. That scar behind your ear, Frank muttered gently. touching the raised line. "What did they do to you, boy?" Phantom turned, slightly pressing his head against Frank's chest. The connection between them was still there, even after all the time and pain. It broke Frank a little more. Later that afternoon, Margaret called, her voice crackling with urgency. "I found something," she said. "An old property deed in Hollister, just 40 miles away. Bought under the name Thomas Boyd, but the signature matches Nathan's employment papers from your ranch. It's a trailer parked near the edge of some abandoned farmland." She paused. "And get this, he registered 2 horses under that address about 6 years ago." Frank's grip on the phone tightened. "Text me the address. I'm calling Jack." Frank and Sheriff Wilson drove out together. The landscape changed as they got closer to Hollister. More overgrown fields. More silence, the kind of place where people don't ask questions, and secrets grow wild like the mesquite trees. They found the trailer just before sunset, tucked behind a line of crooked trees. No lights on, no sound, just the wind and the distant thump of an old windmill. A rusty truck sat beside the trailer license plate, long expired. Sheriff Wilson approached firsthand on his holster. "Sheriff's office. Anyone home?" No answer. He knocked again, then slowly turned the handle. The door creaked open. The smell inside hit them instantly. Dust, old leather, and something else. Something sour. The place was abandoned, but not for long. A plate still sat on the table, food half-eaten. A mug of coffee, cold but fresh. Frank's eyes scanned the room. Photos tacked to the wall caught his attention. One in particular made his heart stop. A blurry snapshot of a young woman on horseback. He stepped closer, pulling it down for a better look. The image was grainy, slightly faded, but there was no doubt. It was Rebecca, and the photo had been taken after she disappeared. Her hair was longer, her face older, but the expression in her eyes was unmistakable. She was on Phantom without question, and behind her, blurred in the background, stood someone else. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face obscured by shadow. "Well, that blows the case wide open," Sheriff Wilson muttered, examining the other items pinned to the wall. More blurry photos maps with handwritten notes, dates scribbled in red ink. "This isn't just a hideout, it's a record." Frank turned sharply. "You think he held her against her will all this time?" Wilson didn't answer immediately. "It's too early to say, but someone's been here recently, and they left in a hurry." He picked up a notebook from the table, flipping through pages of cramped handwriting. "We need to bag all of this as evidence." Outside, the air was thick with tension. The wind had picked up, whistling through the trees like a warning. Frank leaned against the side of the trailer, trying to catch his breath. For 10 years, he had believed Rebecca was dead. Now he had proof she'd been alive at least for some time after her disappearance. But why hadn't she come home? Why didn't she reach out? Was she in danger? Or was there something else she didn't want him to know? Back in town, Margaret analyzed the photos and notes. One map had a circled location near the old Red Bluff Ridge, a secluded area with no cell service and barely any roads. "If he's hiding her, or she's hiding herself, it's the kind of place no one would think to look," she said. Frank's eyes burned with determination. "Then that's where I'm going." Sheriff Wilson raised an eyebrow. "Not alone, you're not. If something's out there, we don't walk into it blind." They planned to head out at dawn with a small search team of deputies. Wilson insisted on doing this by the book, now that they had evidence. But Frank barely slept that night, thoughts spinning like dust devils across an empty field. He stared at the photo of Rebecca until the edges blurred. The pain of the unknown was almost worse than the pain of loss. Was she safe? Was she afraid? Or had she chosen to disappear? As the first light crept over the horizon, Frank loaded Phantom into his trailer. The old horse stood, tall eyes sharp again, like he knew the trail ahead. This wasn't just about finding Rebecca anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, even if it shattered everything Frank believed. The road to Red Bluff Ridge was barely a road at all, just a narrow trail of dirt and gravel winding through dense brush and crumbling fences. Frank drove slowly, the old truck creaking with every bump. Sheriff Wilson followed close behind in his patrol SUV, 2 deputies in another vehicle behind him. Phantom was in the trailer, calm and quiet, as if he understood exactly where they were going. The sun had barely risen, casting long shadows that made the trees look like they were reaching out to stop them. As they neared the ridge, Frank felt a chill crawl up his spine. The area was silent, unnaturally so. No birdsong, no wind, just the crunch of tires on gravel. The sheriff pulled alongside him and rolled down his window. "You sure about this?" Frank nodded. "She's out here. I feel it." "All right then, but stay sharp. Whoever was in that trailer might already know we're coming." They parked at the base of a hill and continued on foot, Phantom tethered to a tree near the vehicles. The trail narrowed further, hemmed in by thick underbrush and low-hanging branches. About a mile in, they came upon a small clearing, a makeshift camp with torn canvas, a burned-out fire pit, a rope tied between 2 trees. Sheriff Wilson crouched and touched the ashes. "Still warm," he muttered. Frank walked to the edge of the camp and found something that stopped him cold, a worn leather bracelet, the kind Rebecca used to wear. He picked it up slowly, his breath catching in his throat. Suddenly, a noise crackling leaves just beyond the clearing. The men spun around. Wilson drew his weapon. "Who's there?" he shouted. No answer, just the sound of something or someone moving away. They gave chase, careful but fast, weaving through the trees. Then, just ahead, they saw her, a flash of long, dark hair, a figure darting between the trees. Frank stopped dead in his tracks. "Rebecca!" he yelled. The figure froze for a split second, turning just enough for Frank to catch a glimpse of her face. It was her older thinner, but unmistakably Rebecca. Their eyes met, and in that moment, Frank saw something that chilled him more than her disappearance ever had fear. Pure, undiluted fear. Then she was gone, disappearing over a ridge. Frank tried to follow, heart-racing, lungs burning, but the hill was steep, the ground unstable. By the time they reached the top, Rebecca was gone. Only footprints remained in the soft earth, small, unmistakably female. Frank stood there, chest-heaving eyes scanning the tree line. She had seen him. He was sure of it. For a moment their eyes had met, but instead of running to him, she had run away. Sheriff Wilson caught up beside him. "She's alive," he said simply. Frank nodded slowly, gripping the bracelet tight in his hand. "But something's wrong. She's not just hiding. She's afraid," he whispered, "and I need to know why." Back in town, Frank couldn't sit still. After seeing Rebecca alive, real and terrified, his world had flipped upside down again. Sheriff Wilson had agreed to bring in more resources, maybe even FBI assistance, given the new evidence of potential kidnapping. But Frank knew waiting wasn't an option. Something in her eyes, even for that split second, told him she wasn't just afraid of being found. She was afraid of who might find her. Phantom paced restlessly in the barn, agitated like he could sense the unease in Frank's mind. Margaret Fletcher met Frank at the ranch later that afternoon, bringing with her an old topographical map of Red Bluff Ridge from the 1970s. "See this?" She pointed to a hand-drawn mark near the northern cliffside. "Used to be a fire watch cabin up here. Haven't seen it on maps in years, but it's on private land now. Property changed hands a few times." Frank leaned closer, reading the faded ink. The land was now owned by a shell company, one connected to a name he hadn't heard in years, Thomas Boyd. Nathan Reed's alias. "Who else knows about this cabin?" Frank asked. "Not many," Margaret replied. "It's been abandoned since the state cut funding for fire watchers in '88, but it has shelter, maybe a well. It's exactly where I'd go if I didn't want to be found." That night, Frank made his decision. He wouldn't wait for the official search party scheduled for tomorrow. Every hour could matter now. He saddled phantom-packed light and made for the ridge just before sunset, leaving only a note for Wilson, explaining where he'd gone. The wind had picked up again, rustling through the trees like whispers. He kept to the old hunting paths, avoiding the main trail, using the skills he'd learned decades ago in Vietnam. It was quieter up here. Still too still. As the light faded, the trees gave way to a clearing, and there it was, a weathered cabin partially hidden behind a wall of brush and pine. The windows were dark, but smoke curled faintly from a chimney. Someone was home. Frank approached slowly, tying Phantom to a tree about 20 feet back. Each step felt heavier than the last. The porch creaked under his boots. He knocked once, twice, then called out softly, "Rebecca, it's me, Grandpa." No answer, just the low moan of wind through the trees. He turned the handle. It was unlocked. Inside the cabin was dim, but lived in blankets folded on a cot. Books stacked in corners, a cracked mirror on the wall. In the far corner, a backpack, her backpack, the one she had the day she vanished. Then he heard a soft creak from the back room. Frank froze. "Rebecca," he called again, stepping toward the sound. The door to the small back room opened slowly, and there she stood, older than her, with wary eyes and hair pulled back in a messy braid. She didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at him like he was a ghost. "It's really you," Frank whispered, his voice breaking. But Rebecca didn't smile. She looked past him toward the door and said in a trembling voice, "You shouldn't have come here. He's coming back." Frank's heart slammed in his chest at Rebecca's words. He had imagined this reunion for 10 long years, hugging her, hearing her laugh again. But now, face to face, there was no joy, only terror. Rebecca stepped forward and quickly locked the cabin door behind him. "You need to leave," she whispered urgently. "If he finds you here, he'll hurt you." "Rebecca, who is he?" Frank asked, eyes scanning her face. "Is it Nathan Reed?" She didn't answer directly. Instead, she looked down her hand, shaking. "He's not the same man he was back then. Something changed. He kept me here, said it was to protect me, said no one else cared." Frank felt rage boiling under his skin. He wanted to take Rebecca and leave this place immediately, to never let her out of his sight again. But her fear was real, and so was the danger. "We can go right now," he said, reaching for her hand. "My truck isn't far. We can—" From outside came the crunch of tires on gravel. Rebecca's eyes widened. "He's here." She grabbed Frank's arm and pulled him toward the back of the cabin. "There's a trap door under the rug. Go now." Frank hesitated. "I'm not hiding while he lays a hand on you." But Rebecca was firm. "Please, if he sees you, he'll lose control." Her voice cracked. "He doesn't know I remember everything now." That sentence hit Frank like a punch. Remember what? But there was no time. They barely made it beneath the floorboards before the front door creaked open. Footsteps, heavy, slow, deliberate. Frank peered through a crack in the wood. A man entered the cabin, taller than he remembered, with gray streaks in his beard and deadness in his eyes. Nathan Reed. His voice filled the room, calm but cold. "You were gone longer than usual." Rebecca stood, stiff arms crossed. "I went for water," she replied, her voice steady despite the fear Frank had seen moments before. Nathan studied her for a moment, then looked around. And who moved the rug? Beneath the floor, Frank reached instinctively for the small revolver in his coat. He hadn't planned to use it, but now everything was changing. Nathan stepped closer to the rug, foot hovering above it. Rebecca's voice trembled. "You said you trusted me." Nathan tilted his head, a smirk playing on his lips. "Trust is earned, sweetheart, and you've been restless lately." Outside, faint sirens echoed through the distance. Sheriff Wilson was on his way, probably having found Frank's note. Nathan's head snapped toward the window. "What did you do?" he hissed at Rebecca. "Nothing," she insisted. "I don't know what that is." Nathan's eyes narrowed as he reached inside his jacket. Frank saw the glint of metal, a gun. His grip on his own revolver tightened. This time, he wouldn't let Nathan disappear, and he wouldn't let him hurt Rebecca again. Nathan yanked the rug aside, eyes locking onto the edges of the trapdoor. For a moment, everything stopped. No one breathed. Rebecca's eyes filled with tears, not of fear, but of silent panic. As Nathan crouched reaching for the handle, Frank made his decision. The trapdoor flew open from below, and in one motion he emerged, revolver raised. "Don't move," Frank growled. Nathan stumbled back, eyes wide with surprise, then narrowing in recognition. "Well, well," he sneered, slowly raising his hands but keeping his gun firmly in his grip. "I always wondered if you'd come looking. Took you long enough." His smile was thin, but his eyes burned with hatred. "You have no idea what she's been through, what she chose." Rebecca stepped forward, her voice shaking but firm. "I didn't choose you. I was 15. You lied to me. You told me they gave up." Frank glanced at her, shocked. She had never said that before. Nathan's face darkened. "You wanted to stay. You said I was all you had." "No," she said firmly. "You made sure I thought that. You isolated me, kept me hidden, fed me lies. You controlled me." Her voice cracked, but she stood tall. Frank saw something shift in her, like she was reclaiming part of herself he thought had been lost forever. The sound of vehicles approaching grew louder outside. "It's over, Nathan," Frank said, keeping the gun steady. Nathan's eyes darted from Frank to Rebecca, then to the window. "You think you know what happened?" He laughed bitterly. "You don't know anything. She's not the same girl you lost, old man. I saved her from something worse." "What are you talking about?" Frank demanded. But before Nathan could answer, the front door burst open. Sheriff Wilson stormed in, gun drawn, followed by 2 deputies. "Drop the gun, Reed, it's over." For a split second, Frank thought Nathan would surrender. Then, with terrifying speed, Nathan lunged toward Rebecca, gun still in hand. Frank fired. The gunshot exploded through the cabin, echoing into the trees. Nathan dropped to the floor, clutching his shoulder, screaming in pain. Wilson and the deputies moved in, kicking away Nathan's weapon and restraining him. Frank lowered his revolver to the floor, shaking all over. Rebecca stood frozen, then suddenly collapsed against him, sobbing. Frank wrapped his arms around her, feeling her thin frame tremble against him. "I thought I'd never see you again," she whispered. Frank held her tighter, his voice breaking. "You're home now. No more running." But deep in her eyes, something still lingered. A fear that didn't fade with Nathan's capture, a shadow that wouldn't lift easily. Frank knew then that bringing Rebecca home was just the first step in a longer, harder journey, the journey of healing. As the deputies led Nathan out to a waiting ambulance, Frank noticed something strange. Nathan wasn't looking at Rebecca with hatred or even anger. He was looking at her with something that almost seemed like warning. "This isn't over," Nathan called out as they pushed him through the door. "Tell her, Rebecca. Tell him about the others." Sheriff Wilson shoved him forward. "That's enough out of you." But the damage was done. Frank looked at Rebecca, whose face had gone pale. "What others?" he asked softly. Rebecca shook her head, wrapping her arms around herself. "Not here," she whispered. "Not yet. Please, can we just go home?" Frank nodded, putting his arm around her shoulders. Whatever secrets still remained would come to light in time. For now, his granddaughter was alive, and that was enough. As they stepped outside into the cool night air, Phantom whinnied from where he was tied. Rebecca froze, then moved slowly toward the horse, her hand outstretched. "Thunder," she whispered, using the nickname she'd given him as a child. Phantom stepped forward, pressing his nose against her palm. For the first time since Frank had found her, a genuine smile touched Rebecca's lips. "He led me to you," Frank said quietly, "after all this time." Rebecca rested her forehead against Phantom's neck, tears streaming down her face. "You never forgot," she murmured to the horse. Then turning to Frank with eyes that held both gratitude and terror, Neither did I. And that's what scares me the most. Frank didn't know what she meant, but he understood one thing clearly. The nightmare wasn't over. It was just taking a different form. But whatever came next, they would face it together. He had found his granddaughter, and he wouldn't lose her again, not to fear, not to the past, and certainly not to whoever these others might be. As they walked toward the waiting vehicles, Rebecca leaned heavily against him. "Grandpa," she said softly, "there's so much you don't know. So much I don't even know if I remember right." "We have time," Frank assured her, though uncertainty gnawed at him. All the time in the world. But the sirens, the flashing lights, and Nathan's words hung in the air like a promise or a threat. This was only the beginning. I'll now write part 2 of the story, continuing from where we left off and following the approved outline. The ambulance took Nathan Reed away just before dawn. His shoulder was bandaged, his wrists cuffed, and his eyes filled with hatred as the paramedics loaded him into the vehicle. The silence in the woods after he was gone was a different kind of quiet. Not heavy or fearful, but the tentative peace of a storm's passing. Rebecca stood on the cabin porch, wrapped in an old blanket, staring at the horizon as the sun crept over the ridge. Her face was pale in the early light, revealing fine lines around her eyes that shouldn't have been there on a 25-year-old. She looked both older and younger than her years, a woman shaped by unthinkable experiences, yet still somehow the girl who had disappeared a decade ago. Frank stood beside her, Phantom tied to a tree nearby, grazing like none of it had happened. Sheriff Wilson approached them, notepad in hand. "I can arrange a ride back to town," he offered. "We'll need statements, but it can wait until you've both had some rest." Frank gently refused. "We'll take the trail," he said, placing a hand on Phantom's back. "Rebecca needs time." She didn't argue. The slight nod told Frank everything she needed. Space, air, the freedom to process what had just happened. Trauma didn't wash away like dirt. It stayed under the skin, working its way out slowly, painfully. Still, Frank could feel something softening in her. The rigid tension in her shoulders eased slightly, the way she leaned toward him almost imperceptibly. She was trying, and that was enough. The ride down was slow. Rebecca rode Phantom silent, one hand gripping the reins, the other brushing against the horse's mane, like she was remembering him through touch. Phantom moved gently, carefully, as if he remembered her too, carrying his precious cargo with deliberate steps. Frank walked beside them, looking up every few steps, just to reassure himself that she was real, that she was safe. The trees opened up slowly into the edges of town, where familiar sights returned. Old barns, mailboxes, the smell of coffee from Mabel's diner. "People will talk," Rebecca said suddenly, her voice stronger than it had been at the cabin. "Let them," Frank replied. "You don't owe anyone anything." Back at the ranch, the house looked just as it had 10 years ago, weathered, but strong against the Texas landscape. Frank opened the door for Rebecca like it was the first day of a new life. She stepped inside slowly, her eyes scanning every object, every photograph, like touching pieces of a dream. Her fingers lingered on a framed photo of her as a child standing beside Phantom, with Frank and Martha, her grandmother, in the background. Her breath hitched. "You kept everything the same," she whispered. Frank nodded. "Your grandmother believed you'd come back. After she passed, I couldn't bear to change anything." That night, they sat on the porch, the stars bright and quiet overhead. Rebecca sipped tea while Frank rocked slowly in Martha's old chair. No one said much. There was no need. The pain hadn't vanished, but it no longer stood between them like a wall. It had become part of their shared story. Something survived. Something endured. The next morning, Sheriff Wilson arrived with a female deputy and a victim's advocate from the county. Rebecca needed to give her statement, but they were careful, respectful, letting her set the pace. "Take your time," the advocate, a soft-spoken woman named Diana, told her. "We can stop whenever you need to." Rebecca sat at the kitchen table, hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. "I don't remember everything," she began. "Some parts are fuzzy. He kept me drugged at first. For months, maybe a year." Frank felt his hands clench into fists. He forced them to relax. "Nathan Mr. Reed worked at the ranch," she continued, her voice steadier now. "He always paid special attention to me, teaching me about the horses. I thought he was just being nice. Then one day, he told me Phantom had gotten loose and was down by the creek injured. I rushed out to help." She paused, taking a deep breath. "When I got there, Phantom was fine. Before I could react, Nathan grabbed me. He injected me with something. When I woke up, I was somewhere else. He told me there had been an accident at the ranch, that everyone was dead. He said he'd saved me." Sheriff Wilson's pen moved across his notepad. "And you believed him?" Rebecca's eyes flashed with a hint of anger. "I was drugged, confused. By the time the drugs wore off enough for me to think clearly, we were far away, and he had convinced me that I had nowhere else to go, that no one was looking for me." Frank couldn't bear it anymore. "I looked for you every day for 3 years, he said, his voice breaking. "I never stopped hoping." Rebecca reached across the table and touched his hand the first time she'd initiated contact. "I know that now," she whispered. As the questioning continued, a more disturbing picture emerged. Nathan had moved Rebecca between several locations over the years, always remote, always controlled. He'd gradually reduced the drugs as her dependence on him grew a textbook case of Stockholm Syndrome. "But something changed about 2 years ago," Rebecca said, her eyes distant. "He started bringing other men to see me. They would talk like I wasn't there, discussing prices. That's when I started to remember more clearly, to question everything he'd told me." Sheriff Wilson exchanged a glance with the deputy. "These men, can you describe them?" "One came more often than the others. They called him Boss. Older, well-dressed, expensive watch. Nathan was afraid of him." Rebecca's hands began to tremble. "I heard them talking once about moving the merchandise across the border. That's when I realized I wasn't the only one." The room fell silent. The implications were clear and horrifying. This wasn't just about Rebecca's kidnapping anymore. It was about human trafficking. "Did you ever see any other women?" the deputy asked gently. Rebecca nodded slowly. "Twice. Once, when we were being moved to a new location. There was a van with 2 other women inside. They looked vacant, like they'd given up. And once at a different cabin, I saw a girl through the window. Couldn't have been more than 17. Frank felt sick. The scope of what they were uncovering was growing by the minute. After the statements were taken and the officials left, promising protection and further investigation, Rebecca seemed exhausted, but somehow lighter, as if sharing the burden had eased its weight slightly. "You should rest," Frank told her, leading her to her old bedroom, preserved exactly as she'd left it. Rebecca stood in the doorway, staring at the teenage sanctuary posters of bands that had long since broken up riding ribbons pinned to a corkboard, a collection of small horse figurines on the bookshelf. "It's like a museum to a person I don't remember how to be," she said quietly. "You don't have to be her," Frank assured her. "Just be whoever you are now. That's enough." She nodded, then closed the door gently behind her. Frank listened to the silence, trying to process everything he'd learned. The idea that Nathan had been preparing to sell Rebecca, possibly into a trafficking ring, made his blood boil, and the thought that there were others still out there, still suffering as Rebecca had, was unbearable. Frank was in the barn checking on Phantom when Margaret Fletcher's car kicked up dust in the driveway. She hurried toward him, tablet in hand, her face grim. "I've been digging," she said without preamble. "That property in Hollister. It's not the only one. I've found 3 others, all purchased under similar aliases, all in remote locations. And there's something else." She showed Frank a property deed. This one was purchased by a company called Frontier Holdings LLC. Guess who sits on the board? Frank scanned the document, his eyes stopping on a familiar name. Charles Hammond, the banker. Margaret nodded grimly. "Pillar of the community church, deacon major donor to the sheriff's department's annual fundraiser, and possibly the boss Rebecca mentioned." Frank's mind raced. Hammond was one of San Angelo's most respected citizens, wealthy, influential, untouchable. "We need to tell Jack," Frank said, referring to Sheriff Wilson. Margaret's expression darkened. "That's the other problem. I'm not sure who in the department we can trust. Hammond has his fingers in everything, including law enforcement. For all we know, that's how Nathan knew we were coming to the cabin." The implication was clear. There could be corrupt officers protecting Hammond and his operation. Their small victory in rescuing Rebecca suddenly seemed fragile, threatened from all sides. That night, Frank couldn't sleep. He paced the house, checking locks, peering out windows. Around 3 a.m, he heard Rebecca crying out in her sleep. He rushed to her room, finding her tangled in the sheets, fighting invisible enemies. "Rebecca," he called softly, careful not to touch her. "You're safe. You're home." She woke with a gasp, eyes wild, before recognition dawned. "Grandpa," she whispered, her voice childlike in the darkness. "I'm here," he assured her. "No one can hurt you anymore." But even as he said it, Frank knew it might not be true. If Hammond was indeed the boss, and if he had connections within local law enforcement, the danger was far from over. The next morning, Frank made a decision. He called Sheriff Wilson directly on his cell phone, asking to meet somewhere private away from the department. They agreed on Mabel's Diner, a place so public that any foul play would be noticed. Wilson arrived alone, sliding into the booth across from Frank. "You're being paranoid, Frank," he said after hearing the suspicions about Hammond and possible corruption. "Charles Hammond is one of the most respected men in the county." "That's how these operations work," Frank insisted, hiding behind respectability. "Rebecca identified him Jack, and Margaret found the connection to the properties." Wilson sighed, running a hand over his face. "I've known Charles for 15 years. He coaches Little League, for God's sake." "Then look into it and prove us wrong," Frank challenged, quietly, without tipping him off. Something in Frank's intensity must have gotten through. Wilson nodded reluctantly. "I'll see what I can find. But keep this to yourself for now, and keep Rebecca safe." When Frank returned home, he found Rebecca on the back porch with Phantom. She'd brought the horse a carrot from the kitchen, and was speaking to him softly as he ate from her palm. It was the most normal he'd seen her since her return, a glimpse of the girl she'd been. "He remembers me," she said as Frank approached. "After everything, he still knows who I am." Her voice broke slightly. "Sometimes I don't even know who I am anymore." Frank sat beside her on the porch steps. "You're Rebecca Morgan. You're strong, stubborn kind. You survived what would have broken most people. That's who you are." She leaned against his shoulder, a gesture so reminiscent of the past that it made his heart ache. "I'm trying to piece it all together," she said. "There are gaps, times I can't remember at all. But I remember enough to know that Nathan wasn't working alone. There were others, important people." Frank hesitated, then decided she deserved the truth. "We think the man you called boss might be Charles Hammond. Do you remember him?" Rebecca's body went rigid. "The banker." Her voice was barely a whisper. "He came to the cabin 3 times. The last time was about a month ago. He and Nathan argued. Hammond wanted to move the merchandise immediately. Nathan wanted to wait." She closed her eyes. "That's when I stopped taking the pills. I needed to be clear-headed to find a way out." "You're incredibly brave," Frank told her, meaning every word. She shook her head. I'm not brave. I was just terrified of what would happen if I didn't escape." She looked up at him, her eyes suddenly intense. "There are others, Grandpa. Girls just like me. We have to help them." Before Frank could respond, his phone rang. It was Margaret. "Turn on the news," she said without greeting. "Channel 8. Frank led Rebecca inside and flipped on the television. A reporter stood outside the county hospital, microphone in hand. Granddaughter confirmed that Nathan Reed, the suspect in the decade-old disappearance of Rebecca Morgan, escaped custody while being treated for gunshot wounds. Authorities are warning the public that Reed should be considered armed and dangerous. Rebecca sank onto the couch, her face draining of color. "He'll come for me," she whispered. Frank's mind was already racing ahead. "We need to get you somewhere safe." But Rebecca shook her head firmly. "No, I'm done running, done hiding." Something had changed in her expression, a determination that hadn't been there before. "I won't let them keep doing this to other girls." Later that afternoon, Sheriff Wilson arrived at the ranch looking haggard. "I'm assigning a deputy to watch the property," he said. "And I've been doing some digging into Hammond. There might be something there, Frank. His bank has handled transactions for all the properties Margaret found, and there are some offshore accounts that raise red flags." "So you believe us now?" Frank asked. Wilson's expression was grim. "Let's just say I'm not dismissing it. But we need more evidence before we can move against someone like Hammond. And with Reed in the wind, things just got a lot more complicated." That night, Frank converted the ranch into a fortress. He installed new locks, set up motion-detecting lights, and kept his shotgun close. Rebecca moved through the house like a ghost, jumping at shadows, checking windows. The psychological toll of knowing Nathan was free was written on her face. "He won't get near you," Frank promised her. "I won't let that happen." She nodded absently, but her eyes kept drifting to the darkness outside the windows. "You don't know him like I do," she said softly. "He never gives up on what he thinks belongs to him." Around midnight, Frank was checking the locks one last time when he noticed something odd. Phantom was agitated in his stall, pacing and snorting. Frank grabbed his shotgun and moved carefully to the barn, every sense on high alert. The barn door creaked as he pushed it open. Phantom whinnied, stomping nervously. Frank swept the beam of his flashlight across the interior, catching a glimpse of movement in the shadows. "Who's there?" he called out, raising the shotgun. "I'm armed." "Easy, old man." The voice came from behind a stack of hay bales. "I'm not here for trouble." Nathan Reed stepped into the light, hands raised slightly. He looked terrible pale, sweating his shoulder bandage soaked with fresh blood, but his eyes were clear and focused. Frank kept the shotgun aimed at Nathan's chest. "Give me one reason not to pull this trigger right now." "Because you want to save your granddaughter," Nathan replied calmly. "And I'm the only one who can help you do that." Frank's finger tightened on the trigger. "You took her from me for 10 years. You drugged her, manipulated her, were planning to sell her. And now you want to help." Nathan's jaw tightened. "You don't know everything, Morgan. You think I'm the villain in this story? I'm just a pawn, same as Rebecca." "Tell that to the judge," Frank spat. "There won't be a trial if Hammond gets his way," Nathan countered. "He's already cleaning house. The deputy who was transporting me dead in the hospital parking lot. Made to look like I killed him during my escape. I've been running ever since." Frank's mind raced. This could be a trick, a way to get to Rebecca. But the detail about the deputy that wasn't public knowledge yet. "Why should I believe anything you say?" Nathan sank onto a hay bale, wincing as the movement jarred his injured shoulder. "Because I care about Rebecca too, in my own way. And because Hammond will kill us both if we don't stop him first." Frank kept the shotgun trained on Nathan. "Start talking. And if I think you're lying for even a second, I'll finish what I started at that cabin." Nathan nodded, accepting the terms. "I met Charles Hammond 15 years ago. I was nobody, a drifter with a record. He offered me a job. Find young girls isolated, vulnerable. Groom them. Make them trust me. His voice grew hollow. I'd done it before for other men. It was just business. Frank felt sick, but forced himself to listen. Then I came here, met Rebecca. She was different, smart kind. I told Hammond I didn't want to take her, but by then I knew too much. He gave me a choice: take her, or they'd take both of us. Nathan looked up, his eyes haunted. I thought I was protecting her in a twisted way. With me, she at least had a chance. The others, Hammond took directly. They didn't last long. So you kept her prisoner for 10 years, drugged her, isolated her, all while telling yourself you were her savior. Frank's disgust was palpable. Nathan shook his head. I'm not asking for forgiveness. What I did was unforgivable. But Hammond's operation is bigger than you know. There are at least a dozen girls being held at properties across 3 counties, and he's planning to move them all tomorrow night. After that, they disappear forever. Frank's blood ran cold. How do you know this? Because I was supposed to help transport them. Nathan reached slowly into his pocket, pulling out a burner phone. This has the coordinates for the meeting point, tomorrow at midnight. Frank stared at the phone, then back at Nathan. If what you're saying is true, we need to take this to the FBI, not the local authorities. Hammond has people everywhere, Nathan warned. We don't know who to trust. Then what's your plan? Frank demanded. Nathan's eyes hardened. We stop the transport ourselves. Save those girls, and get enough evidence to bring Hammond down once and for all. Frank lowered the shotgun slightly. And Rebecca, where does she fit into this suicide mission of yours? She knows Hammond's operation better than anyone. She can identify the other men involved. Nathan's voice softened. But she should stay here protected. This isn't her fight anymore. Frank almost laughed at that. You really don't know her, do you? After everything you've done, everything you've taken from her, you think she's going to sit this out? Before Nathan could respond, a voice came from the barn doorway. He's right, Rebecca said, stepping into the light, a revolver steady in her hand. This is exactly my fight. Frank turned surprised. Rebecca, I heard everything, she said. Her eyes locked on Nathan. And as much as I hate to admit it, he's telling the truth about Hammond. I've seen the coordination, heard the plans. Those girls need help. Nathan stood slowly, hands still raised. Rebecca, Save it. She cut him off coldly. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the girls who are still living the nightmare I just escaped. Frank looked between them, feeling the weight of an impossible decision. Trust the man who had stolen his granddaughter's life, or risk losing more innocent lives to Hammond's operation. In the end, it wasn't really a choice at all. We need to be smart about this, Frank said finally. If we're going to do something this dangerous, we need a proper plan, and we need someone we can trust in law enforcement. Rebecca nodded. Margaret. She can contact the FBI directly, bypass local channels. For the first time in 10 years, Frank saw the steel in his granddaughter's eyes that had been there since she was a child, the determination that had once been channeled into riding competitions and schoolwork, now focused like a laser on saving others from her fate. Keep the gun on him, Frank told Rebecca, pulling out his phone to call Margaret. I don't trust him any further than I can throw him. As Frank stepped outside to make the call, the weight of what they were about to do settled on his shoulders. This wasn't just about Rebecca anymore. It was about justice, redemption, and preventing more lives from being destroyed. The moon cast long shadows across the ranch as Frank looked up at the stars. Give me strength, Martha, he whispered to his late wife. We're gonna need it. Inside the barn, Rebecca stood facing the man who had stolen her youth, her gun unwavering. But it wasn't fear in her eyes now, it was power. For the first time in a decade, she was in control, and she wasn't about to let go of that control ever again. Dawn found them gathered around the kitchen table, Frank, Rebecca, Margaret, and reluctantly Nathan, who remained handcuffed to his chair. Margaret had made calls to an FBI contact she trusted, a woman she'd worked with on a story years ago. Help was coming, but not soon enough. "The transport is happening tonight," Nathan repeated, pointing at the map they'd spread across the table. "Hammond has a private airstrip here, just north of the county line. The girls will be brought from 3 different locations, loaded onto a plane, and gone." Rebecca studied the map, her finger tracing the route. "This road here, it's the only access point to the airstrip. If we block it somehow..." "Hammond will have armed guards," Nathan warned. "These aren't amateurs." Frank exchanged a glance with Margaret. "I served in Vietnam. Margaret's late husband was a sheriff for 20 years. She still has his service weapon and knows how to use it." "And I've been shooting since I was 12, Rebecca added, her voice steady. Nathan shook his head. "This isn't target practice, Rebecca. These men will shoot to kill." "So will I," she replied, her eyes cold. "To save those girls, I would do anything." The plan came together slowly. They would position themselves near the airstrip hours before the scheduled transport. Margaret would document everything from a hidden location, gathering evidence. Frank and Rebecca would create a diversion to delay the transport until the FBI could arrive. "And what about me?" Nathan asked. Rebecca's voice was ice. "You're the bait." As daylight faded, they made final preparations. Frank cleaned his shotgun and hunting rifle, checking each shell meticulously. Rebecca changed into dark clothing, her movements precise and controlled. She'd spent the afternoon practicing with the revolver, her aim deadly accurate. "You don't have to do this," Frank told her as they loaded the truck. "No one would blame you for staying behind." Rebecca secured a flashlight to her belt. "I would blame me," she said simply, "every day for the rest of my life." Frank understood. Some wounds could only heal through action, through reclaiming what had been taken. He saw in Rebecca's determination echoes of Martha's strength and felt a surge of pride despite his fear. As they prepared to leave, Rebecca paused by Phantom's stall, pressing her forehead against the horse's neck. "You led him to me," she whispered. "Now help me find the others." The drive to the airstrip was tense, each lost in their own thoughts. Nathan sat in the back, still handcuffed, his face grim. "Hammond won't be alone," he warned again. "He'll have at least 6 armed men, possibly more, and he never gets his hands dirty. He'll stay back until the merchandise is secured." "Stop calling them that," Rebecca snapped. "They're not merchandise. They're women, girls, human beings." Nathan fell silent, properly chastised. They parked a mile from the airstrip, concealing the truck behind an abandoned barn. Margaret set up her position on a small ridge overlooking the area, equipped with a night vision camera and a satellite phone to coordinate with the incoming FBI team. "Be careful," she told Frank and Rebecca, hugging them both. "This isn't worth either of your lives." Frank checked his watch. 9:30. 2.5 hours until the transport. "Let's get in position." They moved through the darkness, using the terrain for cover. Nathan led the way, his handcuffs removed, but Rebecca's gun pressed firmly against his back. The night was clear stars scattered across the sky like diamond dust, too beautiful for the ugliness they were about to confront. The airstrip came into view, a simple runway with a small hangar, isolated and perfect for illegal activities. A few vehicles were already parked outside the hangar, men moving equipment inside. "That's Monroe," Nathan whispered, pointing to a tall man giving orders. "Hammond's right-hand man, ex-military, dangerous." They settled into position behind a low ridge, watching as more vehicles arrived. Frank's heart pounded in his chest. This was really happening. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and the FBI was still hours away. "Dad," Rebecca whispered, reverting to what she'd called him as a child, her voice suddenly uncertain. Frank turned to her, surprised by the word, as much as the fear in her voice. "If something goes wrong," she continued, I want you to know that I never blamed you. Not once in 10 years. Frank's throat tightened. Nothing's going to go wrong. We're going home together. She nodded, but her eyes told a different story. She was preparing for the worst, just as he was. At 11:15, the first transport arrived, a nondescript van with tinted windows. Frank peered through his binoculars, watching as the back doors opened. His blood ran cold. 3 young women were led out, hands bound, eyes vacant. Just as Rebecca had described. That's Hammond, Nathan whispered as an expensive SUV pulled up. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s stepped out, his silver hair catching the moonlight. Charles Hammond, respected banker, community leader, monster. Rebecca's hand tightened on her revolver. I want him to see me, she whispered. I want him to know I'm the one who brought him down. Stick to the plan, Frank reminded her. We wait for the second transport. Then Nathan makes his move. They didn't have to wait long. A second van arrived at 11:40, followed shortly by a third. More women were unloaded, bringing the total to 11. Frank felt sick watching the methodical cruelty, the casual way the armed men handled their human cargo. It's time, he told Nathan. Don't try anything stupid. Nathan nodded, his face set in grim determination. Just be ready. They watched as Nathan walked openly toward the hangar, hands raised. The reaction was immediate. Guns drawn, shouts of alarm. Nathan called out, I have information for Hammond about the Morgan girl. The mention of Rebecca got their attention. Nathan was surrounded, searched, then roughly escorted inside the hangar. Frank and Rebecca used the distraction to move closer, slipping from shadow to shadow until they reached the side of the building. Inside, they could hear Nathan talking, his voice carrying through the thin walls. She knows everything, Charles. She's going to the FBI, but I can deliver her to you tonight. For a price. Hammond's voice was cultured cold. You've become a liability, Nathan. I don't negotiate with liabilities. She trusts me, Nathan insisted. After everything, she still trusts me enough to let me go. I can bring her here right into your hands. Frank could almost feel Rebecca's rage beside him. The betrayal in Nathan's voice sounded so convincing, so real. For a moment, even Frank wondered if they'd been double-crossed. But then came the signal, 3 quick flashes from Margaret's position on the ridge. The FBI was 5 minutes out. It was time for Phase 2. Frank nodded to Rebecca. She slipped around to the back of the hangar where the women were being held, while he positioned himself near the main entrance. Then he raised his shotgun and fired twice into the air. Chaos erupted. Armed men poured out of the hangar, guns drawn. Frank ducked behind a fuel drum as bullets pinged around him. Inside, he heard Hammond shouting orders. Get the merchandise on the plane now! Frank fired again, taking out the lights along the runway. In the darkness and confusion, he could hear Rebecca working at the back of the hangar, freeing the captive women. Their plan was working, creating just enough chaos to delay the transport until help arrived. Then everything went sideways. A shot rang out inside the hangar, followed by a scream. Frank's heart stopped. Rebecca. He abandoned his position, racing toward the hangar entrance, shotgun ready. He burst through the door to find Nathan on the ground, bleeding from a fresh wound in his chest. Hammond stood over him, pistol in hand, his face contorted with rage. The mighty Morgan. Hammond sneered, turning the gun toward Frank. I've heard so much about you. Frank raised his shotgun, but Hammond was already moving, using one of the bound women as a shield. Put it down, or she dies next. Frank hesitated, his mind racing. Where was Rebecca? You ruined years of work. Hammond continued, backing toward the small plane waiting on the runway. All because you couldn't let go of the past. It's over, Charles, Frank said, keeping his voice steady. The FBI is already here. There's nowhere for you to run. Hammond laughed, a sound devoid of humor. There's always somewhere to run when you have enough money. He tightened his grip on the terrified woman. Now put down the gun, or I put a bullet in her head. Frank slowly lowered his shotgun. He couldn't risk the woman's life. But as he did, he caught a glimpse of movement behind Hammond. Rebecca emerging from the shadows, revolver raised. "Let her go!" Rebecca commanded, her voice ringing through the hangar. Hammond spun, dragging the woman with him. His eyes widened at the sight of Rebecca. Well, well, the prodigal prisoner returns. "I'm not your prisoner anymore," Rebecca set her aim, unwavering. "And neither is she. Let her go, Hammond. It's over." For a moment, no one moved. The air crackled with tension. Then Hammond's face twisted into a cruel smile. "It's never over, my dear. Not for girls like you." He raised his gun toward Rebecca. Frank lunged forward with a roar, but before either man could fire, a shot rang out. Hammond staggered, a look of surprise crossing his face as he released the woman and crumpled to the ground. Behind him stood Nathan Reed, the pistol he'd grabbed in the confusion still smoking in his hand. "You're right," he gasped, blood soaking through his shirt. "It's never over. But at least it's over for you." Hammond lay motionless. Nathan collapsed back to the floor, his breathing labored. Frank rushed to secure Hammond's weapon, while Rebecca freed the terrified woman. "Why?" Frank asked Nathan, kneeling beside him. Nathan's eyes were growing dim. "Because she deserved better," he whispered. "They all did." Outside, sirens wailed as FBI vehicles surrounded the airstrip. It was over. Truly over. Hammond's operation was exposed, the women rescued, the nightmare ended. But as Frank held Rebecca close, watching the FBI agents taking control of the scene, he knew that ending the nightmare was just the beginning. The real work, healing, recovering, rebuilding, was still ahead. Rebecca stood tall beside him, her face illuminated by the flashing lights. In her eyes, Frank saw something he hadn't seen in 10 years' hope. Small, fragile, but unmistakably there. "Let's go home," he said softly. She nodded, taking his hand. "Home," she repeated, as if testing how the word felt after so long. "I think I'm finally ready for that." As they walked away from the hangar, leaving behind the chaos and the darkness, Frank felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Rebecca was alive, she was safe, and she was coming home. The night sky stretched above them, vast and full of stars. Somewhere in that endless expanse, Frank thought Martha was watching, and for the first time in 10 years, he thought she might be smiling. The first light of dawn stretched across the Texas sky, painting the clouds in hues of pink and gold. Frank Morgan stood on the porch of his ranch house, coffee mug in hand, watching as the world slowly awakened. Inside, Rebecca slept her first night of truly peaceful rest since returning home. The events at the airstrip had changed everything. 3 days had passed since the FBI raid that brought down Charles Hammond's trafficking operation. The news had exploded across San Angelo like wildfire. Hammond, the respected banker and community leader, exposed as the mastermind behind a multi-state human trafficking ring. 11 women rescued. And at the center of it all, the miraculous return of Rebecca Morgan, missing for 10 years, and now hailed as a hero. Frank sipped his coffee, watching a hawk circle lazily overhead. The aftermath had been chaotic, endless questioning statements, evidence collection. The FBI had taken over the case, entirely bypassing the local authorities after discovering the extent of corruption within the department. 2 deputies had already been arrested for their involvement in Hammond's operation. And then there was Nathan Reed. Against all odds, he had survived the gunshot wound to his chest. He was now in a secure hospital room under federal guard, facing a lifetime of charges, but also cooperating fully with authorities. His testimony was bringing down Hammond's entire network, piece by rotten piece. The screen door creaked behind Frank. Rebecca stepped out, wrapped in an old quilt, her hair tousled from sleep. "Morning," she said, softly, moving to stand beside him. Frank smiled, noticing how she stood straighter now, how her eyes met his directly, instead of darting away. small signs of healing, day by day. "Sleep okay?" he asked. She nodded. "First night, without nightmares." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sunrise together. So much remained unspoken between them, 10 years of separate lives of pain and struggle. But they had time now. Time to heal, to learn each other again. "Agent Lewis called," Frank said finally. "Hammond's being denied bail. They're finding connections to trafficking rings in 3 states. Your testimony sealed it." Rebecca's face remained impassive, but her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Good," she said simply. The FBI agent in charge of the case, Diana Lewis, had taken a personal interest in Rebecca's situation. As a specialist in human trafficking cases, she'd seen the worst of humanity. But even she had been moved by Rebecca's story, by her courage in facing down her captors to save others. "She also mentioned the other women are doing better," Frank continued. "Most have been reunited with their families." A hint of a smile touched Rebecca's lips. "That makes it worth it. All of it." The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Margaret Fletcher's old station wagon pulled up, and she emerged carrying a box of pastries from Mabel's diner and a thick folder under her arm. "Thought you two might be ready for some company," she called, climbing the porch steps with remarkable energy for a woman in her 60s. Inside, over coffee and cinnamon rolls, Margaret spread newspaper clippings across the kitchen table. The story had gone national with Rebecca's face on the front page of papers across the country. "They're calling you the Angel of San Angelo," Margaret said, pointing to one headline. Rebecca grimaced. "I'm no angel. I'm just someone who survived." "You're more than a survivor," Margaret insisted. "You're a hero to those girls, to their families." Frank watched as Rebecca struggled with this characterization. She'd spent so long seeing herself as a victim that embracing her role in bringing down Hammond's operation was difficult. "The FBI has been getting calls," Margaret continued, pulling out a notepad. "Talk shows, book deals, movie rights. Everyone wants your story." Rebecca shook her head firmly. "I'm not interested in being a spectacle." "No one's saying you should be," Frank assured her, "but your story could help others. Show them there's hope, even in the darkest situations." Rebecca considered this absently, running her finger around the rim of her coffee mug. "Maybe someday," she conceded, "but not now. Now I just want to remember how to live a normal life." The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Sheriff Wilson stood on the porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable. "Frank, Rebecca," he nodded as Frank let him in. "Margaret." The tension in the room was palpable. While Wilson hadn't been implicated in Hammond's operation, his failure to see the corruption in his own department had strained relationships. "What brings you by Jack?" Frank asked, not unkindly. Wilson cleared his throat. "2 things. First, I wanted to let you know that I'm resigning as sheriff, effective immediately." Frank raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Jack?" Wilson held up a hand. "It's the right thing to do. I missed what was happening right under my nose. Can't lead a department after something like that." His eyes shifted to Rebecca. "And I wanted to apologize to you personally. We gave up the search too soon. If we'd kept looking." "It wouldn't have made a difference," Rebecca said quietly. "Nathan had me miles away within days. And Hammond's influence would have buried any leads that came up." Wilson nodded, accepting her words, but not looking comforted by them. "Still, I failed you. Failed this town." He straightened his shoulders. "But that's not all I came to say. Reed's asking to see you, Rebecca. Says he has something important to tell you. Something he'll only say to you." Rebecca stiffened her hands, clutching the quilt tighter around her shoulders. "I have nothing to say to him." "I told him that's what you'd say," Wilson replied, "but he was insistent. Said it's about your mother." The room fell silent. Martha Morgan, Rebecca's grandmother, had died 5 years ago from cancer, but Rebecca's mother, Frank's daughter Jennifer, had abandoned the family when Rebecca was just 4 years old, disappearing into a haze of addiction and troubled relationships. Frank watched his granddaughter carefully. "You don't have to see him." Rebecca's jaw tightened. What could he possibly know about my mother? Wilson shook his head. He wouldn't tell me. Just said it was something you needed to hear. After Wilson left, Rebecca paced the kitchen like a caged animal. Frank and Margaret exchanged worried glances. It could be a manipulation, Margaret suggested. One last attempt to control you. Or it could be important, Frank countered gently. Nathan's cooperating with the authorities. He has nothing to gain by lying now. Rebecca stopped pacing, her expression troubled. I haven't thought about my mother in years. Not really. She looked at Frank. After she left, you and Grandma became my whole world. You were enough. Frank felt a familiar ache at the mention of his daughter. Jennifer had been his greatest heartbreak long before Rebecca's disappearance. A bright, loving child who had fallen into darkness after her husband's death, eventually choosing drugs over her own daughter. His efforts to help her had been rejected time and again, until she finally disappeared completely. Whatever Nathan knows, Frank said carefully, whatever you decide, I'm with you. The next morning they drove to the secure medical facility where Nathan was being held. Rebecca had barely spoken during the drive, her face set in determination. Frank worried that seeing Nathan again would re-traumatize her, undoing the fragile progress she'd made. Agent Lewis met them in the lobby. He's stable but weak, she explained, as she led them through security checkpoints. We've got 2 agents in the room at all times. He won't be able to hurt you. Rebecca nodded her steps, slowing as they approached the room. I need to do this alone, she said suddenly. Frank started to protest, but the look in her eyes stopped him. This was part of her reclaiming her power, making her own choices. I'll be right outside, he promised. Inside the hospital room, Nathan Reed lay handcuffed to the bed monitors, beeping steadily beside him. His face was gray with pain, his shoulder and chest heavily bandaged. He looked smaller, somehow less threatening in the harsh hospital light. His eyes widened slightly when he saw Rebecca. You came, he said, his voice raspy. You said you had information about my mother, Rebecca replied, coldly, staying near the door. So talk. Nathan shifted uncomfortably, wincing at the movement. I met her back in 2015, about a year after I took you. Rebecca's heart pounded in her chest. That's impossible. My mother left when I was 4. She came back, Nathan continued, to San Angelo. She was clean looking for you. She'd heard about your disappearance on the news, came back to help search. He coughed, pain flickering across his face. Hammond found out, saw her as a threat. He assigned me to handle it. A cold dread settled in Rebecca's stomach. What did you do to her? Nathan met her gaze directly. Nothing. I couldn't. Not after. He gestured vaguely toward her. I warned her instead, told her Hammond would kill her if she stayed. Gave her money to disappear again. Rebecca gripped the foot of the bed to steady herself. You expect me to believe that? She gave me something, Nathan continued. Made me promise to give it to you if I ever found you. Said it was proof she'd try to come back. He nodded toward the small table beside his bed. Bottom drawer. The feds documented it as evidence, but they let me keep it here. With trembling hands, Rebecca opened the drawer. Inside was a small velvet pouch. She tipped its contents into her palm, a delicate gold locket in the shape of a heart. Her breath caught. Open it, Nathan urged. Inside was a tiny photograph of a 4-year-old Rebecca, and opposite it, a lock of dark hair tied with thread. On the back, engraved in tiny letters, Forgive me, I tried. Rebecca clutched the locket, memories flooding back. This had been her mother's, a gift from Frank when Rebecca was born. She'd always worn it even during the worst of her addiction. And now here it was, physical proof that Jennifer Morgan had indeed returned, had sought her daughter. "Where is she now?" Rebecca asked, her voice barely audible. Nathan shook his head. "I don't know. She was headed west, that's all I know. Said she wouldn't stop looking for you, but would do it somewhere Hammond couldn't find her." Rebecca stood frozen, the locket burning in her palm like a hot coal. Years of abandonment of believing her mother had never cared enough to stay to fight her demons. And now, this evidence that Jennifer had tried to come back had been driven away by the same evil that had stolen Rebecca's life. "Why are you telling me this now?" she finally asked. Nathan sank back against his pillows, suddenly looking exhausted. "Because you deserve to know someone else was looking for you too. That you weren't forgotten." He paused, meeting her eyes directly. "And because I've taken enough from you already, I can't take this truth too." Rebecca said nothing more. She slipped the locket into her pocket and walked out without looking back. Frank was waiting in the hallway, concern etched on his face. One look at her expression and he opened his arms. She stepped into his embrace, letting the tears come at last. Later, back at the ranch, Rebecca sat on the porch swing, turning the locket over in her hands as she told Frank everything Nathan had said. "Do you think it's true?" she asked finally. "That she really came back for me?" Frank sighed heavily, the weight of old grief in his eyes. "Your mother had many faults, but lying wasn't one of them. If she sent that locket, she was here, and she was trying." Rebecca clasped the locket around her neck, feeling its weight against her skin. "I want to find her." Frank nodded, understanding. "We will, when you're ready." The next few weeks brought a gradual return to normalcy, or at least a new version of it. Rebecca began therapy with a specialist in trauma and captivity. The ranch became a haven, a place to heal away from the media frenzy that still swirled around Hammond's case and her miraculous return. Phantom became an unexpected part of her recovery. Each morning, Rebecca would ride him across the property, rebuilding her strength and confidence. Frank would watch from the porch, marveling at the sight he'd thought he'd never see again. His granddaughter on horseback, hair streaming behind her, sitting tall and unafraid. One evening, as they sat together on the porch after dinner, Rebecca broached a subject she'd been considering for days. "I want to start a foundation," she said, "for survivors like me. A place where they can recover, learn to trust again, rebuild their lives." Frank nodded encouragingly. "Sounds like a fine idea." "I was thinking we could use part of the ranch," she continued, her voice growing animated. "The east pasture, maybe. Build some cabins, a therapy center. Use the horses as part of the healing process." "Like what Phantom did for you," Frank observed. Rebecca smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. "Exactly. We could call it Second Chance Ranch or something like that." "Martha would have loved that idea," Frank said softly, "using this land to heal broken spirits." They sat in comfortable silence as the idea took shape between them. It would be a challenge, certainly fundraising, construction, staffing, but it felt right away to transform their personal tragedy into something that could help others. "There's something else," Rebecca said after a while. "Agent Lewis called today. Hammond's trial is set for next spring. They want me to testify." Frank studied her face. "How do you feel about that?" Rebecca took a deep breath, terrified. "But I need to do it. For myself, for the other women. Hammond needs to see me standing there strong and free, telling the truth about what he did." She twisted the locket between her fingers. "Maybe Mom will see the news coverage. Maybe it will help her find her way back to us." Frank reached over and squeezed her hand. "You're the bravest person I know, Rebecca Morgan. Always have been." The weeks turned into months. Autumn came to Texas, bringing cooler temperatures and golden light. The Morgan Ranch became a busier place as Rebecca's foundation plans took shape. Architects visited, drawing up plans for the therapy center and cabins. Grant applications were submitted. Margaret Fletcher used her media connections to generate interest and early donations. One crisp October morning, exactly 1 year after Phantom had appeared at the auction, Rebecca stood at the fence of the east pasture, watching as construction began on the first cabin. Frank joined her, handing her a mug of coffee. "Big day," he commented, surveying the activity. Rebecca nodded. "I never thought I'd be here doing this. A year ago, I was still in that cabin, believing I'd never be free." Frank followed her gaze to where Phantom grazed peacefully alongside 2 new rescue horses, the first residents of what would become the Foundation's equine therapy program. "You've come a long way," he said. Rebecca turned to him, her face serious. "We all have, but there's still one piece missing." Frank knew immediately what she meant. Despite months of searching, they'd found no trace of Jennifer Morgan. It was as if she'd vanished completely after her encounter with Nathan Reed. "We'll find her," Frank assured her, though his confidence had waned over time. Rebecca fingered the locket that rarely left her neck now. "I know. Somehow. I know we will." As if on cue, Margaret's car appeared on the driveway, moving faster than usual. She parked haphazardly and hurried toward them, waving a folder. "I found something," she called as she approached. "A Jennifer Morgan registered at a women's shelter in Tucson 3 years ago. She listed her emergency contact as Frank Morgan San Angelo, but the number she gave was disconnected." Frank's heart skipped a beat. "That's the old landline. We switched to cell phones after Martha passed." Margaret nodded excitedly. "I spoke to the shelter director. Jennifer stayed there for 6 months, got clean, found a job. She left on good terms, told them she was still searching for her daughter. They had a forwarding address from about 18 months ago." Rebecca took the paper Margaret offered, staring at the address written there. "Sedona, Arizona," she read aloud. "It's a long shot," Margaret cautioned. She could have moved on by now. But Rebecca was already moving toward the house. "We have to try," she called over her shoulder. "Dad, how quickly can we get to Sedona?" Frank smiled at the sound of Dad, still rare, still precious when it came. "I'll book the flights," he answered, following her. 2 days later, they stood on a small street in Sedona, the red rock formations glowing in the afternoon sun. The address led to a modest adobe-style house with a small garden out front. Frank felt his granddaughter's hand slip into his, squeezing tightly. "What if she doesn't want to see us?" Rebecca whispered. "What if she's not even here?" "Then we keep looking," Frank replied simply, "for as long as it takes." Rebecca took a deep breath, then walked up the path and knocked on the door. Seconds stretched into an eternity before the door opened. The woman who stood there was in her early 50s with streaks of gray in her dark hair and lines around her eyes that spoke of hard years. But her eyes, those were unmistakably the same eyes Frank had known since her birth, the same eyes that Rebecca had inherited. Jennifer Morgan stared at them in shock, one hand rising to cover her mouth. "Rebecca," she whispered, disbelief written across her face. "Is it really you?" Rebecca nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. "It's me, Mom. I found my way home." Jennifer stepped forward hesitantly, arms half raised, unsure of her welcome. Rebecca closed the distance between them, embracing the mother she hadn't seen in over 20 years. Over his daughter's shoulder, Jennifer's eyes met Frank's, filled with regret, hope, and a silent plea for forgiveness. Frank nodded once, his own vision blurring with tears. There would be time for explanations for healing the old wounds between them. But for now, this moment was enough. 3 generations of Morgans broken in different ways, finding their way back to each other against impossible odds. Later that evening, as the Arizona sunset painted the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, they sat on Jennifer's small patio. The conversation had been difficult, emotional. filled with tears and painful truths. Jennifer had shared her struggles, her attempts to get clean, her return to San Angelo, only to be driven away by Nathan's warnings about Hammond. "I never stopped looking for you," she told Rebecca, clutching her daughter's hand. "I followed every news story, called every hotline. When the years passed with no word, I started volunteering at shelters, helping other missing girls, hoping someone was doing the same for you." Rebecca listened, absorbing this new reality, a mother who had fought her demons, who had never truly abandoned her in spirit. It would take time to fully reconcile this truth with the narrative she'd carried for so long, but the locket around her neck was a tangible reminder that people could change, could find their way back from the darkest places. "I want you to come back to Texas with us," Rebecca said finally. "There's something I'm building there, something important. I think you could help." Jennifer looked questioningly at Frank, uncertain of her place in their lives after so long. "The ranch has always been your home too, Jen," he said quietly. "It's time for you to come back." 3 weeks later, the Morgan Ranch hosted a small ceremony to break ground on the main therapy center for what would officially be called Phantom's Promise, a rehabilitation facility for survivors of trafficking and abuse. The local press was there along with Agent Lewis Margaret and several of the women who had been rescued from Hammond's operation. Rebecca stood at the microphone, flanked by Frank and Jennifer Phantom, grazing contentedly nearby. She looked out at the gathered crowd, feeling a sense of purpose that had been missing for so long. 10 years ago, I was taken from this ranch," she began, her voice strong and clear. "For a decade I lived in darkness, believing I was forgotten, that no one was searching for me. But I was wrong." She glanced at Frank, whose eyes shone with pride. "My grandfather never stopped looking. My mother never stopped hoping. And when it seemed impossible, a horse named Phantom found his way home, leading them back to me." Rebecca gestured to the plans displayed on an easel beside her. "This center will be a place of healing, where survivors can reclaim their lives, where broken spirits can find their strength again. Because that's what I've learned, that even after the darkest captivity, freedom is possible. Healing is possible. Coming home is possible." As applause rippled through the crowd, Rebecca felt a sense of completion. The circle that had begun that day at the auction yard was closing. Phantom had come home leading Frank to Rebecca. Rebecca had found her way back to the ranch, and then to Jennifer. And now together, they would create a place where others could find their way home too. That night, Rebecca stood in the barn, grooming Phantom, as she had so many times in her youth. His coat gleamed in the soft light, all traces of the neglected auction horse long gone. "You saved us all you know," she murmured to the horse. "Me, Grandpa, Mom, even those other women at the airstrip. You started it all by finding your way home." Phantom nickered softly, pressing his head against her shoulder in a gesture of equine affection. Rebecca wrapped her arms around his neck, breathing in the familiar scent of hay and horse. Outside, the Texas night was alive with stars, thousands of points of light piercing the darkness. Rebecca thought about the long journey that had brought her to this moment, the pain, the fear, but also the courage, the resilience, the love that had never died. In the house, Frank and Jennifer sat on the porch, tentatively rebuilding their relationship over cups of coffee and shared memories. The Morgan family, fractured for so long, was healing imperfectly with scars that would never fully fade, but healing nonetheless. Rebecca gave Phantom one final pat and stepped out of the barn. She looked up at the vast Texas sky, feeling small beneath its enormity, but no longer afraid. Whatever came next, Hammond's trial, the opening of the center, the continuing journey of recovery, she would face it with the strength she'd found in coming home. The brand on Phantom's flank, the M crossed with a 5-point star, had been the key that unlocked everything. It had proven that no matter how far you wander, no matter what darkness holds you home, leaves its mark on your heart. And sometimes, against all odds, it calls you back. Rebecca walked toward the house, toward the warm light spilling from the windows, toward the family that had been broken and scattered, but now sat together under one roof again. Behind her, Phantom's soft whinny seemed to echo her thoughts. They had all found their way home, and in that homecoming they had found not just each other, but themselves, the selves they were always meant to be.